Welcome to Religion 212. This is week number 7. This week we're going to talk about chapters 11 and 12 in your book, which covers 1st and 2nd Corinthians and the book of Galatians. Getting right into it, we're going to answer some of the same questions this week that we've been answering. So let's get right into it. 1st and 2nd Corinthians, who wrote these books? Paul, as per your text, Paul wrote without any opposition. They were written most likely in Corinth. I mean, that's a pretty good guess or thought. What sources were used? They were firsthand accounts from divine inspiration, and they were both letters written to their respective groups of people. When were they dated? 1 Corinthians came in about AD 55, with 2 Corinthians coming in about AD 56, about a year later. Who was the target audience? Church and people in Corinth. Both books were written to the Corinth church. What did it contribute? Teaching how to live as a Christian. Okay. Well, now we're going to get into answering some specific questions, and some of these notes are coming from Zondervan's NIV Worship Bible. Some commentary basically on really why were these letters written, trying to get you to understand not just the literary parts of it or the date and the time periods, but also why were they written, what was in Paul's mind or what was on his heart when he wrote these books. And so we'll start with 1 Corinthians in this video, and then we'll follow it with 2 Corinthians and Galatians in two different videos. In 1 Corinthians, Paul's first letter to the Corinthians helps us to answer the question, how can we be a holy people set apart for God if we cannot escape our own culture? How can we honor God in worship using our cultural forms, yet without compromising God's holiness and our own? Well, that's a good question to ask, because so many times today, there's so many different cultures around the world that you might say, how is Christianity relevant to each individual culture? Well, Paul was dealing with some of the same problems with the Corinthian church. They were so consumed with their religious culture of Judaism and other things before Christ came that they just couldn't get out of the mindset. They just couldn't fathom that this God would send his son to live on earth and die for the salvation of others without them having to do anything, without them having to earn it in any way, shape, or form. It just had been so ingrained in their culture that they could not get out of that thinking that they had to earn salvation, that they had to earn a right to go to heaven. So his main purpose in writing 1 Corinthians is to motivate immature Christians. He actually calls them infants in the text, who have clung to their profane values of their culture, prizing religious experience, self-centered individualism, social privilege, and personal freedom to live a Christian life that is aligned with Christ's teaching. Paul calls on the Corinthians to live a Christ-centered life, not shaped by their culture, but by the gospel of the crucified Christ. And that's coming from chapter 17, verses 17 through 18. Chapter 1, verse 17 through 18. Such Christ-centered living esteems revealed truth over spiritual experience, corporate growth over individual gain, countercultural concern over social privilege, self-giving love over self-expressive freedom. When we allow the gospel of Christ and the revealed word of God to mold our lives, then we will live and worship as holy people. Although Paul alludes to his extensive private worship in chapter 14, verses 18 through 19, his focus in this letter is upon corporate gatherings. He calls the Corinthians away from their self-absorption to a loving concern for one another and for the edification of the whole church in chapters 11 through 14. It's no accident that the love chapter, chapter 13, many of you may have heard it before, comes right in the middle of Paul's discussion of Corinthian worship. We will serve God fully and truly only when we serve one another with a Christ-like love. Love guides and gives eternal value to our acts of worship. And so we're going to finish this up in another video talking about 2 Corinthians.